Welcome Home, a podcast for veterans, about veterans by veterans, is a project of Willing Warriors and the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run.
Good morning. I'm your host, Larry Ziliox, Director of Culinary Services here at the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run. And today I'm really excited to have as a guest Dr. James Stone, who's with the University of Virginia in Charlottesville at the School of Medicine. And I read an article about his program, maybe not his program, but a program that they have going down there where they're studying the effects of blasts on traumatic injury or creating traumatic injury in Tier 1 operators and troops that are subjected to multiple blast events. And so I really wanted to have him on. I read this article and I had about 1 million questions. We won't get to them all today, but Dr. Stone, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry. I really appreciate the interest and opportunity to chat with you for a little bit here today.
Yeah, if you would, could you tell us a little bit about the program itself, sort of the parameters of what you're looking at, maybe how it got started, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this really is a collaborative program, and it is. I think it's kind of a perfect example of the phrase that it takes a village when it comes to doing really significant things. And I've been part of a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional group, and the two key partners really have been the Naval Medical Research Center, which is now known as the Naval Medical Research Command, that's up in Silver Spring, and our program at the University of Virginia. And then we've had various other collaborators that have included, folks out at the University of Utah, Dr. Lisa Wild, Dr. Jessica Gill up at Hopkins, and others. Our group in general has been really interested in looking at what the overall brain health effects are of repeated low-level blast exposure. And what we mean by that is that this is really a phenomena. This is what we're really kind of interested in, the phenomena of where folks are, service members are exposed to repeated blasts in their environment. And so these are not like the large explosions that one would expect to immediately remove an operator from the field and then have them sort of immediately checked out by medical and perhaps receive additional treatment. These are routine, repeated exposures that may be from a situation, involving breaching maneuvers, maybe in a scenario where there is artillery that's involved. Could even be in a scenario where there are various EOD-related activities that are taking place. And these are considered just sort of routine day-to-day exposures. What our group has really been looking at is, what are the overall brain health effects? First of all, are there adverse brain health effects? And what are those effects? Then how much is too much? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the crux of what our program is looking at. And in terms of when we got started, we started looking at this back in the 2006-2007 timeframe. And it all got started by the community really kind of self-presenting at that time. So this is right around the time when there was a lot of very striking information that was coming out of the Defense Veteran Brain Injury Center with some of the service members that were coming back from armed conflicts at that time. Mm-hmm. There was an extraordinarily high amount of traumatic brain injury that was being reported in those individuals. And there was also a significant association with blast exposure that was being uncovered from some of the very good work that is being done by that center at that time. It really continues to be done by that center as well. And so with some of the public awareness that came from some of these studies that were being done back then, the community of, it was really the breaching community back then, self-presented and basically were describing things like memory difficulties, headaches, word-finding issues, and other sort of cognitive symptoms that are kind of typically associated with mild traumatic brain injury and other brain-related disorders. And so I was pulled in at that point, really as kind of the imaging representative from a broader group to take a look at at breachers, and the study itself was really kind of came out of the Quantico Dynamic Entry School, the weapon training battalion up there, where they do a number of different courses where they will teach breaching maneuvers. And so we basically were engaged to look at a group of students that came in for a 2-week course. We are going to look at two different 2-week courses. And we never intended on looking at the instructors of those courses, but the instructors, sort of halfway along the process of designing the study said, hey, can we be involved as well? And of course, we wanted them to be involved, even though the study wasn't really powered for them to be involved. We're always, wanting to kind of partner with our communities, and this was something that we, of course, wanted to be accommodating around. And what we actually found was that a student or a group of students who come in and do this 2-week training course, and before and after the course, based upon the measures that we were using at that time, they really didn't have any kind of measurable differences coming into the course versus leaving the course. And these were folks that had relatively low levels of career blast exposure, but the instructors actually showed a difference. So the instructors showed some changes on some of the memory tasks that we were using at that time. And they also showed some changes on neuroimaging as well. And that was really kind of the start of it all, was, looking at this relatively small number of instructors and showing that these folks who had been exposed to considerable amounts of blast because, they were involved not just in this one course, but they were involved in a lot of different courses, were in fact showing changes. And so that got a lot of attention, and it led to a number of follow-on studies, a lot of which, our collaborative group have been involved in, that have involved, partnerships with some of the New Zealand special ops folks down in Auckland. It's involved partnering with the NIH and looking at career breachers. It's involved study looking at special operators, and we're just wrapping up a study looking at personnel that work primarily with artillery over a career as well. So it's been, it really has been something that we've been working for a number of years now to develop. But I think there's enough sort of data that's come together at this point to demonstrate that yes, in fact, cumulative exposures over time, while any one of those individual exposures into and of themselves don't necessarily cause a detectable change, they can add up over time. They can add up in a way that has an adverse consequence when it comes to brain health.
What do you see as the ultimate goal for the study results? When you present your results, is this, do you think, going to turn around and change policy to say you can't be exposed to a certain number of these low-level blasts over a certain amount of time? Or do you think it will result in maybe redesign of warfighter equipment to better protect the soldier against these sort of issues? What was the goal when you started the program?
Yeah, so the goal when we started the program is to understand if this was objectively a real phenomenon, to bring objective information to some of the subjective reports that were being brought forward at that time, to see if there was actually, using the best measures that we had available at that time, to see if there were things that we could see that were changing in blast exposed individuals. And now that we've kind of demonstrated that yes, indeed, it is really a phenomena, it is really something where there's a cause and effect, then of course the goal at this point is to be able to promote healthy brains, to be able to promote brain health. And the Department of Defense, Kathy Lee is up at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, has been involved in a lot of this, but there's a whole warfighter brain health program that's launched in the last year or so that is not just about TBI, not just about blast, but it's about psychological health, and otherwise it's all about basically maintaining warfighter brain health. And so that our goals are very closely aligned with that program. and that we're here really to try and keep warfighter brains as healthy as possible. And so that can take a lot of different forms. It can take the forms of exactly what you just described, which is, you know, asking and answering the how much is too much question.
Yeah.
And so where is that threshold beyond which, and not every individual, not every service member is going to be the same. There's going to be some folks that are going to have a threshold that's slightly different, and that's sort of true of really almost all diseases and environmental insults that we look at. But on average, where are those thresholds where after you get beyond those thresholds, then there may be noticeable near-term changes, and there may be significant risk for long-term changes as the warfighter ages as well. And so understanding what those thresholds are, because once you understand what those thresholds are, then you can, be making, individual and unit related decisions around what exposures look like. And I'll say that, the other field that looks a lot like this is radiation exposure. And so, there are folks that work with radiation on a day-to-day basis, radiation workers, be them medical personnel or folks that work in an industrial setting where they will have monitoring in some form or another. Either it will be, direct sort of badge related monitoring, or it will be sort of a report of the types of environments that they worked in. And then there are decisions made sometimes around if someone is sort of getting up to a threshold of safe exposures, then, they may be moved into a different environment. So they don't sort of exceed what those thresholds are. And there's this kind of general tenet out there. It's called the ALARA principle, which stands for as low as reasonably achievable. Knowing that repeated blasts are something that can affect brain health, then there can be a general principle there of minimizing risk to whatever degree is possible. Of course, much like radiation exposure, blast is going to continue to be a part of training operations, but it's how do you end up minimizing blast while at the same time being able to kind of accomplish the mission?
Yeah.
Or to be able to get effective training. And so that's one element of it. But, of course, the ability to be able to design better gear and to be able to think beyond helmets that are designed primarily really now for ballistic purposes, and to be able to sort of think about how you have headgear and other gear that may be made with the type of material that have the actual properties within the material to serve as a damping barrier for the most injurious sort of frequency elements in the blast is another consideration. And then there's sort of a medical side of this, which is, are there things that you can kind of, have on board before you might be exposed to a blast that might help from an overall sort of brain biology perspective to kind of ameliorate brain health related issues. And then on the other side of it, are there treatments that, for folks that have had considerable exposures are having symptoms as a result of those exposures? Are there things that can be done to improve their overall quality of life and to improve rehabilitation as well? So it really is a multi-pronged approach that spans the entire spectrum from, trying to minimize exposure, trying to have the best protective equipment possible, and then trying to work on really a biological level to be able to optimize brain health.
And I would say one of the very first observations that you've really come across there is to say, for a long time, it was widely believed Tier 1 operators would not retire so much as that they would move from a operational status to more of a training status. And it sounds as though that's not a good idea here, because they're being subjected to the same thing they were in the field, if not more. So the concept of being moved out of operations and into training, I think they're going to have to take another look at for sure. I'm curious if your research has shown that at a certain point you reach that high risk level, but then it really ramps up rapidly after that. Like after so many exposures, do you get to a point where much more damage is done by just a few more?
Yeah, that is a really important question. And we are actually just starting a study that is going to help us answer that question. And so, one of the biggest challenges in doing these kinds of studies early on was understanding what an individual warfighter's exposure context was, what their background was in terms of how much have they been exposed to, what types of weapon systems, what's sort of the frequency element to it as well, because we know in general from other studies of traumatic brain injury that if you have exposures that are really close to one another, then that can create a scenario where the brain is sort of responding and repairing from one exposure, but it doesn't have the ability to be able to completely repair. And so there's sort of a synergistic quality that can occur when you have things that are exposures that are occurring one right after another. And so historically, when we first started doing this work, we really didn't have good tools to be able to kind of capture all of that. And one of the things that has really come out of this work has been the creation of a self-report tool. It's a pretty brief tool. It only takes about 5 minutes to complete, but it's called the Blast Exposure Threshold Survey. And it's something that an individual service member can fill out that basically captures their career exposure in a structured way. And so what that gives us is a set of really 6 individual numbers that describe what exposures have been by weapon system, and then gives sort of a cumulative single number that is meant to be a representation of a career exposure. And so we've done a few different studies now, and there are a lot of other groups that have been picking up this BETS tool in order to be able to understand, what exposure has been in the groups that they're looking at as well. But we're embarking on a study that's going to look at both active duty as well as veterans, and then we're going to look across a spectrum of exposure to try and ask and answer that how much is too much question. And what we will get is not only what it looks like sort of moving up to that threshold where we start getting kind of conversion of some of these biomarkers that we're looking at that are a reflection of brain health, but then we'll be able to see sort of the overall curve of how quickly things change beyond that level. And so that'll obviously be very important to know. And looking across the sort of lifespan really as well helps us to look at the other questions out there, which relate to, does a career history of exposure, is that a setup for neurodegenerative sequelae later in life? And what I mean by neurodegeneration are really, not necessarily classic Alzheimer's, classic Parkinson's, or classic frontotemporal dementia or some of these other things, but are there processes that are kind of put in place that are really sort of chronic perpetuating processes that later in life could manifest in a way that that has an adverse impact? This most recent study that we did that showed high levels of neuroinflammation, high levels of inflammatory activity within the brain, which we know is kind of central to so many of these other processes, really raises that question for us, which is this just a phenomena where you're kind of exposed and you have the immediate brain health related effects of being exposed that are a reflection of a cumulative exposure, or does this kind of trigger a process that is sort of a smoldering process that worsens as things move on later in life, as can occur with some of these other sort of dementia-related conditions and things like chronic traumatic encephalopathy and otherwise. So that's really what we're gearing up to look at in this study that we literally just started recruitment for in the last couple of weeks.
Now, this tool, this blast measurement tool that you've implemented, is that an anonymous tool, or does that get tagged to somebody's medical records?
It is currently a tool that exists on paper. And so it's a tool that is a questionnaire that can be filled out. And then there is an Excel spreadsheet that can be used as basically a calculator to determine the results of that tool. There is no connection to anybody's medical record with the tool. With all of the studies that we're doing, they're very much firewalled from a medical record. There's complete anonymity when it comes to the particular studies that we're doing. with the tool itself, again, it's really mostly a pencil and paper tool at this point. So there's no connectivity to a medical record. We are working on moving this towards an app, towards it being something that can be deployed on an iPad or an Android tablet. Our vision of that deployment would be something that an individual service member or somebody who's directing a study could download directly from the Apple or the Android store. But again, there would not be connectivity to an individual's medical record. It may be ultimately that the tool ends up being something that is worthwhile from a clinical perspective, but our implementation, as we are envisioning at this point, would not be anything that would have any direct medical record connectivity. It would really be for the purposes of research. And we'd like to make it widely available so even a service member could download it onto their tablet and they could get their own number.
So we've just found that your tier 1 operators are very often reluctant to report injuries, only because it can take them out of the game. And that's their whole life for many of them. And so we see them with a lot of TBI, a lot of PTS that goes unreported. I would hate for that to discourage participation in your research, because the research itself is just so valuable, which leads me to the funding. If I'm correct, it's a DoD funding through the Navy?
That's right.
And
it's through come through a number of different channels. There is funding that comes through the group up at Fort Detrick, Military Operational Medicine up at Fort Detrick has provided some funding. There is Section 734 was from the National Defense Authorization Act a few years ago, and there's an allocation of funding that came from that. So, and certainly we partner with the Navy on this. The Navy has provided some funding, but it really comes from a number of different sources. But all of these sources in common have an interest in helping to support the addressing some of these questions related to brain health and blast exposure.
And where are you with that funding? Are you using it up? Is there going to be more? I mean, just so important, the work you're doing. I hate to see it fall by the wayside because somebody didn't budget for it.
Yeah, I think our experience with this has been that this is a problem that is seen as a significant issue at all levels. And so, our impression has been that members of Congress are very, very tuned into this. And they're very engaged in advocating for their constituents when it comes to this. That folks at a policy level are very aware of this, and they're very interested in helping to set some of the requirements that inform, some of the funders, some of the program managers will help to sort of select from a funding perspective. And then there continues to be an annual allocation for being able to fund this kind of research. And so, I think there's very broad recognition across, really all the different levels that I've been able to observe from, my perspective and, my impressions from other folks that I've sort of talked with who are on the intramural side as well, that this is a problem that is seen as significant. It's one that there's a recognition that there needs to be ongoing investment in. And, I think we've made some important progress in this space. We have a long ways to go. I think, we're also very cued into the importance of being able to provide incremental gains back to the communities as we're able to provide them while we're still sort of working towards that long-term vision as well.
Yeah. Well, I know that there are a good number of VFW and American Legion members that listen to the podcast, and I would tell them that this is serious, really important work, and you need to discuss this at your post meetings, at state meetings, at the national level to make sure that there's pressure being put on that this funding doesn't go away for any reason. Doc, I really appreciate you taking the time to explain the program to us, give us a better understanding of what it involves and how important it is. I do hope that as you find out more and it's relevant, that you'll reach back out and come on again as a guest, because We'd really like to keep track of all the work that you're doing.
I'd love to do it, and really appreciate everything that you and all your listeners are doing and have done. So be happy to reach back out and connect as we've got more to share.
Great. Well, for our listeners, we'll have another episode next Monday morning at 0500. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can reach us at podcast@willingwarriors.org. Until then, thanks for listening.
The Welcome Home podcast is brought to you by Willing Warriors, a nonprofit organization serving active duty service members and veterans since 2012. To learn more, please visit our webpage at willingwarriors.org.